In fact, I'm going to give two talks and squash them down. I won't make it longer as a consequence. The first is a brand new talk, which started last year, and the second is one I gave 10 years ago on Tom Rayworth and some of the associated poets. And they've come together because, on reflection, having written the first paper, I realised actually somebody reminded me I'd done something 10 years ago which actually matched it. So, in fact, I don't quite agree with that, but you'll see that as we go along. And you'll notice that I've produced, via Olivier, produced a list of all the slides that you will see. That's partly out of acknowledgement and thanks for the people that have made the work. And it might help act as an aid to memoir, if that's what you'd want. Throw it away if you want to remember anything. That would be the best thing to start with. I've taken the concept of decoherence from the work of quantum physicists. And my development of the concept refers to a condition of confidence in various truths and being able to verify these truths, having in effect to rely on interlocutors or black boxes to assist our perception. In quantum mechanics, electronics are described by a wave function, a description of quantum state of a system. The probabilistic nature of the wave function gives rise to various quantum effects. As long as there exists a definite phase relation between different states, the system is said to be coherent. This coherence is nervously named as a fundamental property of quantum mechanics and is necessary for the function of quantum computers. However, when a quantum system is not perfectly isolated and in contact with its surroundings, that is, its living conditions, coherence is partly lost, and a process called quantum decoherence pertains. The comprehension behind the concept of decoherence was first introduced in 1970 by Dieter Zey. He didn't use the term, but he used the concept. With decoherence, we're in transition to a mixture of states, and poetically in a shifting state between perception and confidence in interlocution. Just to reflect back on this, it's almost possible to use terms like decoherence backwards at times. When you read Alexander Gilchrist's, what he wrote on the life of William Blake, an unknown painter, in 1863, he noted that to read and reread many times Europe, a Prophecy and other prophetic volumes, a reader would do so with a deepening conviction that their incoherence has a grandeur about it, as that of a man whose eyes are fixed on strange and awful sights, impossible to bystanders. Today I want to approach the idea that in fact Gilchrist was dealing with an example of decoherence, and that today we continue to be in a state of strange and awful sights. The planetary situation for humankind continues to be based on estimation. When and where I first understood this simulation of the Earth's magnetism, I soon recognized that our confidence, reliance on a north-south dipole, was only a generalized overview of our situation. At some local levels, in some rock forms, magnetism varies from the dipole. The Earth has been through periods of pole reversal on many occasions, and this has led to alignments in rocks that have been caught in stone and then lost in compatibility to the process's larger context. The simulation of the geodynamo described here by Gratzmeier and Roberts demonstrates a magnetic field over 40,000 years. The model incorporates a finitely conducting inner core which undergoes several polarity excursions, and near the end of the simulation, a successful reversal of the dipole movement, the dipole moment. We're also, from studies of magnetism and minerals in ancient clay pots, aware that the Earth's magnetic field was approximately twice as strong in Roman times as it is now. Human beings and their ancestors have been on the Earth for a number of millions of years, during which there have been many reversals, but there's no obvious correlation between human development and reversals. The idea of a higher consciousness was proposed by postures in yoga practice about 4,000 years ago at least. Philosophers, mathematicians, theoretical physicists continue to provide isolated scenarios for the planetary situation. They confuse their vocabularies with separations of time and space. They confuse themselves with ideas of higher and lower consciousness. For instance, Fichte's idea to distinguish the finite and empirical from the infinite and pure, an activity that proposed discovery by a higher intuition, provided a bridge from Kant, the philosopher, to Hegel. Kant argued that a change occurs between sensation and perception. When a human perceives an object, it becomes changed by thought. Humans comprehend things in relation to their worldview. An object can appear in two forms: how it actually is, how it is perceived. The former is beyond the senses. It is the attribute of the object that exists but cannot be perceived by the limits of human consciousness. The spectrum contains numerous forms of light, but humans can only perceive visible light. That doesn't mean that the light shined down upon humankind consists only of the visible spectrum. For Hegel, the infinite does not stand as something finished and complete, above or superior to the finite. It's as if the finite had an enduring being apart from or subordinate to the infinite. As poets, painters, artists, we should question estimates and idealizations, which have become crispations, tensed and encrusted shapes. The map of the world is being redrawn daily. On the Mappa Mundi, drawn around 1300, Jerusalem is in the centre. East is on the top, showing the Garden of Eden, in a circle at the edge of the world. Great Britain is drawn at the northwest border, that's the bottom left. The labels for Africa and Europe are reversed, with Europe inscribed in red and gold as Africa, and vice versa. Photography from weather satellites informs our estimations and challenges our availability. The French might say disponibility. This map shows vegetation vitality as seen from a weather satellite in 1988. The Mediterranean has discoloured by the sun radiation reflected from the surface of the sea, which dazzled the sensor. Heracles fires arrows while Hesione hurls rocks at a dragon, the legendary monster that was said to appear on the coast of Troy near Sagium. Our mythologies can derive from mistaken identities. On this late Corinthian bowl, we recognise that the legendary monster that appeared on the coast of Troy, this is an archaeologist called Adrian Mayer, interprets the head of the dragon as in fact an image of a fossil that was emerging from the cliff. We sometimes see the Pleiades, cluster of stars, with unassisted eyes. It is among the nearest cluster to the Earth and most obvious to the naked eye at night. But our understanding of what is perceived continues to be fraught. This and the cosmos beyond our nearest galaxy relies on machines to inform our estimations and availabilities. These stars are defined by the presence of non-ionized helium lines and the absence of singularly ionized helium in the blue-violet portion of the spectrum. They appear extremely luminous and blue. The dust that forms a faint reflection around the stars is from an unrelated dust cloud in the interstellar medium through which the stars are passing. The cosmos within what we see in subatomic structures and situations can be recorded by using interlocution machines that inform us. They are the basis of decoherence. We are confident in our knowledge, but coherence, certainty, and incoherence are no longer our options. As poets and artists, we must challenge normalization and crispation. Werner Heisenberg articulated in 1927 that the position and the velocity of an object cannot both be measured exactly at the same time, even in theory. He called this the uncertainty principle. The image here is of real particle tracks in a liquid hydrogen bubble chamber and shows the production and decay of a negative omega particle. The invention of bubble chambers in 1952 revolutionized the field of particle physics, allowing real tracks left by particles to be seen and photographed in an expanding liquid that had been heated to boiling point. We already know through structural morphogenesis, that is catastrophe theory, through the work of C.H. Waddington, René Thom, Christopher Zeeman and others, that our heartbeats and nerve impulses are not predictable. They can be qualitatively clear, but not quantitatively certain. We have always been in this situation. We can now recognize it. This image shows a three-dimensional reconstruction of a rotavirus at a magnification of around 50,000. Submicroscopic understanding using machines and the simulation of our diseases is how we read our prognoses. This virus is responsible for more than 450,000 deaths each year. Viruses are cellular parasites. The linkage between viral and host functions makes clear the study of a viral life cycle, an important key to cellular functions. Structural studies of viruses by using cryo-electron microscopes and three-dimensional image reconstruction methods have grown in the last decade. Their success in identifying virus complexes provides the foundation for future explorations of more complex viral pathogens. But we can only understand this through the use of machines. Brain scans using diffusion tensor imaging continue to propose to locate what Descartes went to Holland to discover, the seat of the emotion. The specific site for this human activity is still not established, but it is the poets and artists that we need to bring that about. These magnetic resonance images, scans of two human brains involved in learning Mandarin Chinese language, show activity corresponding to contentment in red and anger in blue. We're in a world where simulation takes us to task and provides us with artifacts as information. We continue to be heightened by the use in cinema and on video, where the importance of reading can be replaced by instantaneous response. We no longer rely on reading images in Europe left to right. They're simply coming straight forward at us. Our English and European manner of reading left to right, undermined as it already was by Chinese and Babylonian scripts, for instance, is now challenged by rapid image receipt from a moving film or video, shot directly at our eyes as immediate damage. In the 1970s, we simulated an alternative planet orbiting the Earth on a space station. We used models that were already destroying the Earth they simulated. This image produced after the experiments carried out by NASA on spacecraft and space station cabins subjected to zero gravity and high impact conditions in the 1960s. In 1975, NASA study worked out the broad engineering requirements for a toroidal shape space colony design. Our reliance on news broadcasts are fraught with manipulation to smooth out our dilemma. Voyager 1, after a 2-year journey, came close to Jupiter in July 1979. 2 photographs were issued by Finlay Holiday Films from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory of NASA. They both show the same volcanic caldera venting gases on Jupiter's satellite Io. The first photograph on your left shows the event imaged in heavy pixelation by the electronics as they were received from the radio signals. The second shows the event re-imaged and simulated so that it can be better read and used in news media. Artists and poets know that aesthetics is a basis in patterns of connectedness, the basis of consciousness, and patterns can be reinvented, changed, reinvented. The engagement of consciousness with the world and artifacts is through patterns of connectedness. Patterns of connectedness are how consciousness works, how memory operates, how the nervous system and the immune system work. For example, Lauren Sumparak noted that the innate human immune system has a hardwired memory, which is extremely important in defending us against everyday invaders. This memory is the result of millions of years of experience, during which the innate system slowly evolved pattern recognition receptors that can detect signatures of common invaders. When we view artifacts, we are understood through the way their elements connect through various recognitions and produce an order or patterns. These connections are made possible by different empirical experiences and decisions about the recognition of connectedness in the artifact, namely that there are patterns that match each other and that there are recurrences, or what you are looking at in relation to the world you know or are coming to know in the process of knowing. The natural phenomena of pattern recognition that recurs in our experience of living on a spinning planet continue, but our momenergy may shift. In 1952, Alan Turing proposed a hypothetical molecular mechanism called the reaction diffusion system, which can develop periodic patterns from initially homogeneous state. Many theoretical models based on reaction diffusion have been proposed to account for pattern phenomena in morphogenesis. The marine angelfish has stripe patterns that are not fixed in their skin, unlike mammal skin patterns which simply enlarge proportionally to their body growth. The stripes on the Pomacanthus, this angelfish, maintain the spaces between the lines by the continuous rearrangement of the patterns. Although the pattern alteration varies depending on the conformation of the stripes, a simulation program based on a Turing system can correctly predict future patterns. The striking similarity between the actual and simulated pattern rearrangement strongly suggests the reaction diffusion wave is a viable mechanism for the stripe pattern of the fish. We can also, for example, factor change through phase shifts. We can recognize the shifts from simply boiling a kettle from water to steam, liquid to gas. The transition from one phase to the next is a blur. So that's part one. That's what I was looking at last year. Doesn't seem to have much to do with Tom Raworth on the surface. This part of the talk looks at the beginning of decoherence aesthetics, derived from a reappraisal of aesthetics and its relation to ethics. In 1998, I used the opportunity to talk at King's College in London to look at a particular sequence of poetry by Tom Raworth. Cover of Visible Shivers. Why I'm using Tom Raworth's work as an example has to do with what he does, or rather how he does it and why he does it. A combination of formality, recurring motifs, and disruptive practice. A complex of mainstream artifice and its subversion. I use a range of situationist methods and ambitions which interface with what Tom Raworth does, and I've been helped by the way he's developed and encouraged poetry in Europe and North America. After 30 years reading his work, as that was in 1998, I'm amazed at the experience of combining understanding with bewilderment, or put it differently, between clarity and doubt, which he maintains for me. I find I still don't know what he's talking about sometimes, and still feel strongly interested in reading him. And it is in that activity that interests me, that coming out of what I am calling the ethical that interfaces the aesthetic. I was asking what ethical implications arise from creative interdependence of the self and the other. That is, particularly, for instance, if we follow Wittgenstein, 1921, ethics and aesthetics are one and the same. I'd want to review that and maybe unpack it a bit and say that ethics and aesthetics are concomitant and that ethical relations with aesthetics are bound by a parallel geometry, which knowing cannot really exhaust or unravel. When you engage with the work of a poet like Tom Raworth in a soliloquy or in the silent activity of reading a poem to yourself, he puts it into question, through the text as a score, your spontaneity by the presence of the poet as other. And this momenergy of spontaneity may be defined as ethics because your engagement is one of yourself with the other, And in that special case I'm proposing here, that other is named and known to you as the writer of the poem you are engaging with, which gives you the context of having read Tom Raworth's work before, perhaps in the knowledge of some aspects of Tom Raworth's position. To paraphrase David Selborne, the most important concern of poetry is with the conduct of language which bears upon our fellows. One modernist aesthetic for this engagement derives from the complexity of collage and simultaneity, and follows Comte de Lautréamont, Max Ernst, Pierre Reverdy, and then André Breton. We can recognise collage as the exploitation of the chance meeting of two distinct realities on an unfamiliar plane. That is the culture of systematic displacement and its effects. Breton says the marvellous faculty of reaching two distant realities without leaving the field of our experience. They are coming together, drawing out of a spark of putting within reach of our senses some distant figures carrying the same intensity, the same relief as the others, and in depriving ourselves of a system of reference, of display in our own memory, that is what provisionally holds us. In relation to this, the idea of this whole business of ethics is quite fraught. Jean-Francois Lyotard noted, the human race has to dehumanize itself in the sense that it is still a biocultural species, so as to rise to the new complexity, so as to become telegraphic. The ethical problems raised by technoscience are there to prove that the question has already been raised. When you can simulate in vitro the explosion of the sun, or the fertilization or gestation of a living creature, you have to decide what you want, but we just don't know. I've never reached the true centre, writes Tom Raworth, where art is pure politics. That is in a letter included in Visible Shivers, which is what I want to look at now. But what I want to look at now, rather, is Eternal Sections. And it begins with 42 14-line poems. It follows on from the beginnings of Sentence to Death, which is, they're all 14-line poems, which this book follows. I get that the right way around anyway. If I didn't, we can pick it up. And these sequences consist of 184 14-line poems. And these sets overlap. The sentence he gives to shape completes with two other sets, one called Survival, one called Name Unknown, from a 14-line set of poems published as Clean and Well Lit in 1996. All of these 14-line poems are self-contained, but they do not use the structure of a sonnet unless we want to say that the structure of the sonnet is in a debate between Philip Sidney's Astrovel and Stella and Ted Berrigan's The Sonnets, or perhaps between Shakespeare's sonnets and Gilbert Sorrentino's The Orangery. The rushing darkness of the summer evening across the dirt road from the white farmhouse, a white wooden church, its yard overgrown with sweet grasses, and in the dark blue air, the slow scribbling of the fireflies. An old black Ford with stained grey seats parked in the massing shadows, the shadows of two horses merge in a field of rye. In an orange light in the dining room, a woman clears the supper dishes from the table. Sweet voices of girls from the church steps, and muffled from inside, the Ford, thin popular song, resplendent with half-truths and darkness, summer evening, rushing. In 1978, the University of Texas published The Orangery by Gilbert Sorrentino, a book of 83 14-line poems. The poems would not easily be described as sonnets, and this is because so much depends on how you want to understand what constitutes a sonnet. But in terms of English Elizabethan sense of it, the examples cited by Sorrentino and Tom Raworth to come are not sonnets in the way that they begin and end. In the beginning of Visible Shivers, Raworth puts a parody of a sonnet, which is more like a sonnet and which is, tongue-in-cheek, he calls Sonnet Days. Each of the cited 14-liners by Raworth begin in lowercase type. Each avoids proper nouns in the main, with few exceptions, and each generalises specific reference. The line break is the main punctuation. There is some repetition of vocabulary groups such as specific sites or visits to places or texts like King Lear, or for example, as a reference, Africa at the beginning and a few other parts in Sentence to Death. There is, for instance, reference to the slave trade, missionaries, caravanserai, fundamentalism, Tunisia, still called primitive, spiritual figures, and so forth. There's an almost collagic link with the machinery like photocopier, explicitly xerograph, through endless corridors of the office photocopier, as he puts it, but also baggage machines, television, computer, hospital apparatus, all of which from different angles might be considered to have a collagic and simulative activity comparable to the earlier and contemporary work of Richard Hamilton. Another way Raworth deals with this is almost towards a post-collagic activity, insomuch as it does disrupt in the normal sense, in which he will mix a cookery book with a book on healthy eating. The loveliest of spring flowers were once thought to improve memory, to help enrich with their heady fragrance a book of fruit organically grown, so suitable to go with red meat, which is why a little juice of lemon from the finest natural ingredients used to fight fevers is a great digestive, excellent with fish, goes well with chicken. That's read at half the speed he would have read it. There's also a disruptive discussion in the book, in eternal sections, of Islamic art. So cogent activities are going on within the work. Not at all disruptive in one sense, but disruptive in the terms of the sensibility shifts from one poem to another. What I number 50 in eternal sections, he doesn't number the poems, on page 29, starts with minarets were built singly, ends with figurative representation, which is still, of course, contested amongst various Islamic and Christian historians. Raeburn also makes specific use of scientific texts in the sequence. These numbers I'm adding to the text, not the numbers he gives. Distributed by this strange phenomena, easily watched by rain, water, a well-informed person twists that around as him, will enjoy electrical energy understandably alarming to the public, but others argue people seeking redress may well receive exposure to naturally occurring radiation shooting through their bodies, a device called a grid, intensely at close ranges before indoor showers. Obviously relating to radiation industry on one part, or the problem of radiation and the factor of radiation in the natural environment. And one of the repetitions that go right through the poems in the sequence has to do with perceived colour, that kind of radiation, and light, which is an odd way of saying the word black keeps recurring, black tunics, ifs black defined, the black silk, black tire tracks, the blackness under his eyelids, black from decay, black hole, night darkening around us, a tall black vase, his black overcoat. And this actually helps us understand where Tom's tradition is, or where his peers and mentors are. It immediately takes me back to Robert Creeley, I Know a Man. As I said to my friend, because I am always talking, John, I said, which was not his name, the darkness surrounds us. What can we do against it, or else shall we, and why not buy a goddamn big car? Drive, he said, for Christ's sake, look out where you're going. So then move on to Gilbert Sorrentino's The Darkness Surrounds Us, in his book of that name, in fact. Just to read the first 14 line section of it. Not so much, perhaps, darkness, but that here, for the moment, there is no darkness. And so it seems we're sort of blanketed with light, I might say even warmth, and then I might say, in what I know is selfishness, throw on another goddamn piece of wood, hustle up some coal, the hell with that, I mean all that out there. Let's kind of be like Indians, because the darkness is all around us, which of course reiterates goddamn and darkness surrounds us and so on. So we're getting there. So as I've said, that's obviously derived from Creeley's poem, and they do ring with an ambient feeling about the two authors, Creeley and Sorrentino, in aspects of the way Tom Raworth talks about details of death and emotional activity. If if that is one way of saying it and addressing it. It's also the blackness or darkness of the leveller in Tom Raworth, the Gerard Winstanley of 1650, in which school learning or university learned ones draw a veil of truth, as Winstanley puts it, and that to some extent appeals to Tom's approach. Although it's worth noting at this moment and recalling Tom Raworth's autobiography, his fiction, including reference to the fact that his father was a classicist, and elsewhere Tom uses the work of Plotinus. There are also many colours in Tom's work, heightened in orange lilies, blue moonlight, silvery trails, red through scarlet and pink, and there's a lot of blue and red through the sequence of these 14-line poems I've been talking about. And from this empiricism, or from this report of phenomena, there emerges a subject for whom or which universal truth and natural law come to be seen as illusions, or traps is the term I would use in preference. They are traps to the extent that they would lead you into a negative philosophical understanding of existence, and the extent that my perceptions of the world affect my reality, and the evidence for this is considerable. I have a corresponding responsibility to attempt to bring into being a coherent relationship between my thought processes and the world they emerge from and interpret. But this provided an immediate dilemma. Coherence is the product of a diversive practice, and I might need to consider the structure and multiple locality of experience in that I demonstrate for myself the need for quantum field comprehension in the study of consciousness and its reciprocation in aesthetics. And the three features or the components of that might be the concept of a field, an energy jump technology, and the sub-informational effects, which are not exactly collagic at all, but they're processes that get lost in absence very quickly. A multiple locality can be defined in order to recognize that the correspondence between the classical and quantum realms, between, for example, Thomas Young in 1802 and John S. Bell in 1995, doesn't hold. The complexity of consciousness and aesthetics is radically impoverished in the classical domain by the classical requirement, which is singular locality and cannot possibly achieve the richness of the phenomena observed. The structure of consciousness and aesthetics contravenes any singular locality criteria, and the poetry of decoherence, aesthetics, takes the form of a hyperstructure. This is again from internal sections. Competing with the others who treat and prevent ulcers of personality, if you like, a judgment system in voodoo, unless you've seen them foremost in their memories, you start to notice things grow up, make mistakes, look the same, in a parody of a stagger to the point of paranoia, but profound, nonetheless, an open invitation over the pounding Gaelic backbeat. We could refer to Emmanuel Levinas, because despite his romantic logjam, has constructed great innovation in the model of the saying and the said, as the way of explaining how the ethical signifiers feature in the ontological language. I might say that the content of my words have identifiable meaning as the said, while the saying consists of the fact that these words are being addressed to an interlocutor, and whilst there is an ambiguity in that vocabulary between the multiple locality and the person, there is enough definition in the matter for a voice, enough metaphor in the term speech, to give utterance, albeit artificial, singular coherence. The saying is the sheer radicality of the human speaking, because speaking itself is eventful, an event of being, so to speak, in relation with another or with many others. It is an ethical residue of language without a necessity of a theme, although there is proposed here a theme that escapes comprehension and is the very enactment of the ethical movement from the same to the other. And refer myself back to a pop song by Placebo, Since I Was Born I've Started to Decay, nothing ever else goes my way. This is in fact a collage from Tom Raworth. This is leading me into how death pervades Tom Raworth's work in the sequence in discussion, and how in a sense he deals with it through humour, in a sense without it being hilarious at all. Visible Shivers is dedicated to Mary Raworth, née Moore, and Thomas Alfred Raworth, who died in 1983 and 86, his parents. And The Selected is dedicated to his daughter Lisa, who died in 1996. But it would be simply too crude to identify a reference to death in the work, except to note its proximity to us as receivers of Raworth, as other to the human ontological condition, that is to say, the inevitable process towards death that we're all involved in my view. In the simplest case, it is also, as John Barrell has it in 1990 in his address at Birkbeck discussing Shelley and Raworth, that works seem to develop a relation between the sentence and the shape it can give the words, or to experience and therefore to the self, and the fact that it can give that structure only insofar as it comes to an end. As it comes to an end. He and the fact that can give that structure only insofar as it comes to an end. He therefore rhymes that with sentence to death and eternal sections. In Eternal Sections, Raworth writes, this is in 18, reserving the right to legally define alive. And Visible Shivers, if we shift away from what Derrida says in The Gift of Death to a secret to make you tremble, not simply quiver or shiver. Writing breaks from the limited concept of context because the written sign always exceeds its content, and by virtue of its robility, by which I mean its robustness, it endures beyond the present momentage because its inscription, and to be obvious, after the death of its author. The discourse suppresses the interruption of the discourse in relating to them together in the way that early collage does, and how post-collage has to deal with that. It was always going to be putting things together so as to consider in a way that occurs and whether or not there is a deliberate disruption in that bringing together. And if there is a deliberate disruption, why is that considered viable? And what is the aesthetic activity in doing that? What's the purpose or function of the activity? The practice of restricting each poem in the sequence to 14 lines promotes a structure into which the writing is heightened by its limitation and potential condensare. In addition, a poem could retain the discontinuity which in a surface narrative or interruptions of discourse could be recovered and related within the immanence of the said through conservation in the retained evidence of the damage. But where discourses are uttered as narrative, they may still interrupt the telling to one who listens, situated outside of the said, outside all that the discourse embraces, which is true of the discourse that I am in the process of projecting. The passage from ethics to politics is synonymous with a move from responsibility to questioning, from the proximity of the one for the other, to a relation with others, and thereby the sequence of poetry by Tom Raworth in discussion allows me to understand myself, like others, where the question of justice can be raised. The difficulty is that the primacy of politics is the primacy of the synoptic, a panoramic vision of society, which leads to a disinterested equation with the whole. Politics begins not when you organise to defend an individual, particular or local interest, but when you organise to further the general interest within which your particular interests may be represented. For Tom Raworth, such a panoramic vision, that of a poet, is in a state of danger because the vision loses sight of ethical difference, the poet's particular relation to an obligation towards the other. For Tom Raworth, ethics is ethical for the sake of a new conception of political space-time that differs from disinterested equations. The real politics of the work of Tom Raworth is the aesthetic practice of the work, and that demands a comprehension that reading participates in a shift of expressions from states of coherence into states of decoherence. Well, thank you for listening to that.